welcome to the Gift Show. My guest today is Gerard Tannam. Gerard is the founder and owner of Island Bridge, the branding agency based in Dublin. Gerard, you're very welcome on the Gift Show.
Thanks very much, John. Delighted to join you and your listeners this morning.
You're most welcome. I saw a very interesting post in the RTE app over the weekend, and it's all to do with inflation. And the topic was that parents are starting to cut back on children's activities, sport activities in particular, and also music. So parents are paying for less amenities now than they were in the recent past. It's a sign that inflation is starting to bite in the home and people need to cut back. With that in mind, have you seen the impact of inflation in your own home and in your own business?
I certainly have. I mean, I'm in the kind of fortunate position that my children are raised, so I don't have the kind of typical household to manage, like many of our listeners, I'm sure. But even within my own kind of household, I've certainly seen that I'm starting to ask kind of questions about certain purchases and expenditure. And I suppose, like many people, aiming to see if I can reduce kind of waste first, rather than cutting out things that are perhaps luxuries, but still the luxuries that make life kind of worthwhile. So I think, like many people, starting to be kind of conscious that I suppose we built up habits in times of plenty. Where we're perhaps kind of wasting energy, kind of wasting food, wasting other resources, and maybe buying things that we don't really need on impulse, and perhaps with a little bit more less preparation than we might,
Yeah, I know what you're saying there, Gerard. That's a good point, actually, because there was a person talking there one evening on RTE News, or one of those post-evening news channels, and they were talking about the fact that one way of cutting discretionary expenditure is, if you're going to go into Costa for a cup of coffee, by all means buy the cup of coffee, but don't buy the bun that goes with it.
Yes.
Or you leak money. And also, having a washing machine on that's only half full, for example, is another area that people can look at to reduce cost or waste. Yeah. What advice would you have for the hard-pressed family that has children in university and they're paying university fees, or they have children in secondary school or national school, and they're having to fork up money galore on school books, amenities, activities, and pay a mortgage at the same time?
Yeah, well, I guess I kind of echo what the same things I often say to our own clients. And I suppose the type of things which are common sense, but not necessarily easy to do, or to even get involved in the planning of doing. And I'm thinking particularly of sitting down at the beginning of the week, beginning of the month, and just kind of mapping out what you're going to be spending on in the coming kind of week or months. I remember myself, my mother had worked as a young woman in the ESB, in the accounts department. And my own memories of growing up were that on a Saturday, Mum would kind of sit at the kitchen table doing kind of fairly rudimentary accounts. And she would be quite irritated if she was out a penny. Not so much for the penny itself, but just for the fact that she'd failed to kind of balance the books. And I know that family finances as well as business finances have become much more complex than those kind of more simpler days. But at the same time, I think it's a good practice for us to kind of plan what we're going to spend. And of course, it's quite daunting, particularly when prices are rising, and especially when energy, for example, is literally kind of doubling, tripling. It's terribly daunting and can be very demoralizing. So the temptation is to abandon it halfway through. But it's such a good exercise. And I think when we look more closely at what we're spending, we can identify ways in which we can kind of cut back. And I think also in which we can kind of select maybe a little better some of the activities or some of the expenses that we're incurring. I suppose back to your first observation regarding kind of leisure, sports, those activities. I mean, certainly in my own experience, there was a period of time where my kids were doing all the sports available. And I mean, many of them didn't have big price tags attached that were, local GAA, local soccer clubs, whatever. But at the same time, we could, all of us probably be a little bit more judicious in where we spend without feeling like we're cutting back, because I think that's it's tough. It's tough in a family, particularly. It's tough to say to your kids, we can't have something. But I think with a little bit of planning, we can certainly kind of cut some of those corners off the rising prices.
Yeah, and I'm presuming your own business, you're going to be looking at your budget for 2023 very shortly. And you might say to yourself, what value add am I getting from these expenditures? You might have to look at reducing some expenditure to keep within target for next year, I presume.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. One of my clients kind of suggested something to me. I mean, most of what I've learned in business, I've learned from our clients rather than they're learning from me. I have a great belief in listening closely to what people are doing, or watching closely what they're doing, and learning lessons from them. But one of my clients talks about looking to grow your kind of productivity, grow your business by 10% by taking measures to grow rather than focusing overly much on taking measures to save. And his kind of rationale is that the temptation is to let go, we say, a 10% of your workforce. We can no longer afford to have 10 people on the factory floor working in that. So let's look at ways in which we can reduce our headcount by one, and therefore we'll make a kind of a saving of 10%. He's more of the view of, let's see where the opportunities are to grow by 10% and have everybody focused on that growth, so that we can continue to keep that headcount. And I think that's a kind of a helpful approach, particularly in business, because if we look back to the last period of time where families were coming under pressure, not so much because of inflation, but because of the banks' financial crisis. But the effects were still the same on businesses. There was less cash. People were under more pressure. But I think when you look back, many of the businesses that have kind of grown over the last 10 years grew through those difficult times. In hospitality, I heard Pat McCann, who was formerly with Delata, a former client of ours with Maldron Hotels. He talks about how kind of his worst day in business became his best day in business, simply because he was kind of forced to look at ways of growing their way out of difficulty, rather than kind of hunkering down and waiting for the storm to pass. And I know that I'm a big admirer of Bobby Kerr and his insomnia story. And again, Bobby's no longer involved with insomnia. But at the beginning of the last downturn, when it was obvious to Bobby that there was less money in people's pockets, they instituted a really nice initiative where they made a coffee and any pastry, any coffee or any drink and any pastry available. I think that it was for $3.50, and then any sandwich and any drink for $5.50. I may have got the numbers wrong, but you get the idea. And the principle really was that he worked on his side to ensure that people didn't have to give up their treats. What he looked at was to find a way to enable his customers to continue to spend money with him, and then on their side for them to be able to continue to enjoy their break during the day, or their coffee on their way to work, whatever that might be. So I think some of that approach is useful. It might sound a little simplistic, and perhaps some of our listeners are asking kind of how does that apply in my situation. But I think when we do sit down and kind of say, let's take a partnership approach almost to fixing these problems, in my experience, too often we take a somewhat adversarial approach to fixing problems around around finances, around budgets, etc. And in my experience, kind of the best results come about when the buyer and the seller sit down together
Yeah.
and work out how they can make it work for them both. So there's a great expression from the farming community, which is you got to leave something on the table for the other fella.
Of
And I
course,
think sometimes when we get into cost cutting mode, we don't want to leave anything on the table for anybody. We want to take it all for ourselves, you know?
of course, yeah. So I know what you're saying there, and I had experience of this myself in third-party logistics, where you'd be talking to customers about, collaboration and how we can work together to achieve overall savings. You
Yes.
can't just think in terms of yourself. You've got to think in terms of the customer and the pressure they're under from their senior management to, do better. And you have to put something on the table for them to
Yes.
work with. Otherwise, it's just compromise.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Outcome.
Yeah.
I do like your idea about increasing productivity, because what you're saying there is you're getting more output per employee. On the other hand, if you start cutting employees and your output is the same, you're expecting more from fewer people effectively. And that can be adversarial, as you're saying. Yeah, but you often get that in Anglo-Saxon type organizations, or Anglo-American organizations, I should say, where they tend to be very bottom line focused, and they often put pressure on, units around the world to increase productivity maybe by 30%. And if they
Yes.
have to cut overhead or cut headcount, so be it.
Yes.
That's the approach they take. It's very bottom line focused. So I think from today's interview, big takeaway I have for people is look at your discretionary expenditure and prioritize paying your utility bills. I know it's difficult in these difficult times where utility prices are going up through the roof by threefold, but you have to look at the small expenses and see how you can trim those out and save money in those areas to pay the big bills. So on that note, Gerard, it's been great having you on the show today, and thank you very much for your input and time.
Thank you very much, John. A pleasure to join you.
You're very welcome.